Hello again everyone, and today I'm really pleased to present you with an exciting new fast standard zoom lens from Sigma, their 28 to 70mm f2.8 DG-DNC for contemporary. It's a full frame lens which will be available for Sony E-mount cameras as well as L-mount Alliance cameras, and when it's out it's going to cost $900 or about £760 here in the UK. So while it's hardly cheap in absolute terms, it's only a little more than the lowest priced equivalent competitor on the market, Tamron's 28-75mm f2.8 RXD. I'd like to thank Sigma UK for sending me a copy of this lens for evaluation, although as usual this is a totally independent review. I'll be looking at both its strengths and its weaknesses. Fast standard zoom lenses with an aperture brightness of f2.8 are a perennial favourite for photographers. They combine the convenience of a useful zoom range with a relatively bright maximum aperture for shooting in darker situations and getting out of focus backgrounds in your images. Normally, their zoom range starts at a wider angle of 24mm, but there's been a recent trend to make these lenses start at only 28. That's not an especially wide angle, but it does allow the manufacturer to make the lens far smaller and a bit less expensive, which is eminently desirable on a mirrorless camera system. And the first thing you notice is just how very small this Sigma lens is. It's the smallest and lightest option in its class. In fact, it doesn't feel all that much bigger than a standard kit lens, so that's quite an achievement from Sigma, particularly to people like me who appreciate small camera lenses. When it comes to build quality, this one feels almost exactly like one of Sigma's high-end art series of lenses. The only difference is that, instead of metal, Sigma's thermally stable composite polycarbonate has been used in the construction of its body, so it feels a bit more plasticky. Still, that seems to have kept the weight down very well, as this thing only weighs 470 grams, just over a pound, so it will feel well balanced even on a smaller camera body. It's based on a metal lens mount which is surrounded by a thin weather sealing gasket. Sigma advertised the lens as being splash and dust resistant. Then comes a rubberized zoom ring, which is one of the nicest I've ever used on a standard zoom lens actually. It turns a little heavily and very smoothly and evenly, with lots of damping to prevent any stickiness. It's a dream come true for video makers. Then you get an auto manual focus switch, which is not to be taken for granted on a mirrorless camera lens either. Then there's a slightly cheaper feeling plastic manual focus ring, which also turns smoothly and responds very well with the lens's focus motor. Another nice bonus for video makers is that this lens exhibits very little focus breathing, as you can see here. The lens's autofocus motor is quite quick, even on my older Sony a7R II camera here. It's almost silent and works accurately too. The front glass element of the lens is water and oil repellent to make it easier to clean, although I personally try to just leave a good quality UV filter on the front of my lenses for safety. Its filter thread size is 67mm and it comes with a good quality plastic lens hood with a little rubber trimming on the bottom. The lens does not feature image stabilization, although that's not too much of a problem as most Sony cameras have it built into them nowadays. Overall, the fit and finish of this lens is excellent. It's so small and light, and everything about it just works perfectly. There's something about a really nice quality zoom ring, especially that seems to float my boat. Anyway, moving on, let's look at image quality now. Its focal length of 28-70mm means that it's really intended more for full frame cameras, so this time I'll just be testing it on my Sony a7R II with its 42MP full frame sensor. At the widest angle of 28mm and the brightest aperture of f2.8, in the middle we see razor sharpness and excellent contrast right away. The corner image quality isn't quite as sharp, but it still remains very good. f4 sees a wee bit more brightness and sharpness, and f5.6 looks excellent. The lens remains this sharp down to f11, although as you'd expect, stop down to f16 to see some softness from the effects of diffraction. A good start at the wide angle end. let's zoom in about halfway to 45mm now. At f2.8, we still see excellent sharpness right away in the middle. The corners look a little softer now than they did at 28mm, but the image quality is still just about holding together. Stop down to f4 and the quality looks good, and at f5.6, excellent. Again, the lens stays this sharp down to f11, so it's a good performance in the middle of the zoom range too. Finally, let's zoom all the way into 70mm. At f2.8, image quality is a little softer in the middle now, with lower contrast. The image corners look a bit softer again. They look about the same at f4, but now, back in the middle, we see very good sharpness and contrast. f5.6 now looks perfect in the middle, although the corners still look a bit weak. f8 sees a slight improvement in the corners, but f11 looks quite good there now. Overall, this is a fairly typical performance for a good quality f2.8 standard zoom lens, although the lens doesn't buck what seems to be a bit of a trend for the telephoto focal length of those kind of lenses to be a bit softer. I was really hoping for a bit more hitting weight at 70mm. But if a lens manufacturer has to compromise, that's the best one to make, because it tends to be at wider angles that you want more corner sharpness. Alright, let's look at distortion and vignetting. Your camera will normally correct these for you, but here are some raw images with the corrections turned off. We see quite strong barrel distortion at 28mm and very dark corners at f2.8. Stopping down to f4, f5.6 or f8 will brighten those corners up well enough though. Zoom in to about 40mm to see that barrel distortion begin to flip into pincushion distortion, and at 70mm the pincushion distortion is very strong, and again we see heavy vignetting in the corners at f2.8. Again though, stop down to f4 or f5.6 to see that vignetting clear up. So it's rather a poor performance for distortion and vignetting there. You will definitely want to leave your in-camera corrections turned on. Next, close-up image quality. When you're zoomed out to 28mm, the lens can focus down to about 19cm for some pretty dramatic images. At f2.8, the close-up image quality is a little soft and colourful, but stop down to f4 or f5.6 for major improvements. If you zoom into 70mm, the lens can focus down to about 38cm. At this setting, and at f2.8, there are very serious problems, with close-up image quality being dreadfully soft and colourful. f4 isn't really any better, although at f5.6 we begin to see sharpness, albeit still with colour fringing on contrasting edges. It's only at f8 do we see good image quality again, so if you're zooming in for a very close shot, you definitely want to stop down to f8 or so for sharpness and to avoid that longitudinal chromatic aberration. When it comes to flaring, when you're zoomed out, the lens does an excellent job when working against bright lights, with very little flaring visible at all. When you're zoomed in, more flaring emerges, but it's still less than average, so it's a good performance overall here. When it comes to the softness of your outer focus backgrounds, in almost all my test pictures, this lens's bokeh looked lovely and smooth, and that's not something to be taken for granted on a bright standard zoom lens. Overall, well, it's very clear what Sigma's key design priority was with this lens, a compact size for a useful zoom lens, and this they've certainly achieved. They had to make some compromises along the way. While it's pretty sharp overall, its image quality at 70mm at the widest apertures could have a bit more bite, and its distortion and vignetting were a bit disastrous too. Then again, those problems are somewhat offset by the lens's very nice soft bokeh and good work against bright lights, good contrast overall. With low focus breathing and a zoom ring that's very well damped, it's also a great choice for video makers. I'll probably make a little comparison video one day between this Sigma lens and Tamron's very slightly cheaper version. My initial impression from looking at test charts is that the Sigma lens is a bit sharper. But overall, this new lens from them is a nice package, especially for people like me who like to use compact size full frame lenses, so it does come recommended.